Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Fred Kagan. I'm the director of the Critical Threats Project and the Christopher Demuth Chair here at the American Enterprise Institute. And I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing today's speaker, and then I will be moderating a brief Q&A discussion with him and with your questions as well. It's an important moment. Actually, that's becoming very trite. Every moment is an important moment to talk about terrorism, unfortunately, because we see it growing and expanding every day. This is a particularly interesting day, and even that statement is getting trite, because the president has just asked for a congressional authorization to use military force in support of a campaign where he's actually already been using military force for a considerable period of time, and has also taken the unusual step of asking for Congress to constrain the abilities that he already has to use the force that he's already using. This is an interesting moment and something that I think we can expect Chairman McCaul to discuss a little bit. There are very few people who are more qualified to speak about this topic than Chairman McCaul. He was working on counterterrorism issues with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Texas before he joined Congress. He's been the chairman of the critically important Homeland Security Committee in the House since January of 2013. And he has for us today, I think, a very important statement that's out of the weeds and really looking at the bigger picture of where we are and what we need to do. And I think it's a terrific honor for us to be able to host this event. So without further ado, Chairman McCaul.
Well, thank you, Fred, for that introduction. It's really an honor to be here before AEI, a great think tank. We rely on your products quite a bit in the Congress, and I normally don't read prepared text, but I think in this case I am. As Fred mentioned, the subject matter and the subject matter before my committee is becoming unfortunately more and more relevant as the threats seem to rise in the nation. And as Fred mentioned, the AUMF is going to be a huge topic of discussion. I also serve on foreign affairs and will be the committee of jurisdiction for the AUMF. We had an interesting meeting with the White House that I will get into a little bit in the speech, but perhaps more in the Q&A. So again, I just want to thank all of you for being here. In the recent weeks, we've seen really the true face of evil from our enemies. And we saw it in the video of ISIS burning a young Jordanian pilot to death, almost like a Hollywood movie production, a horrific movie. We saw it in the celebration of terrorist operatives responsible for the death of Kayla Mueller, a 26-year-old American woman who devoted herself to helping those in need. We saw it in the actions of a would-be attacker who wanted to target the United States Capitol here in Washington, D.C., and we saw it in the murderous campaign on the streets of Paris. The barbarians, I believe, are at the gate, and it's time for this nation to confront them. Today, we are at war. We're at war with violent Islamist extremism, the perversion of a religion into a deeply insidious worldview. And for 6 years, the president has denied it and has put our nation on a path of retreat. This denial has allowed our enemies to surge, and it is the reason I stand here before you today. Today, I'm going to discuss three areas. First, I'll explain how a reluctance to lead has invited danger to our doorstep. Second, I will explain why we are entering the defining struggle of our time, and will outline the extent of alarming extremist threats facing the United States. Finally, I will share with you how I believe we can and we must restore the path to victory in the war against Islamist terror. First, the president's reluctance to lead, combined with a false narrative about the threat we faced, has allowed radical Islamists to surge. We have known throughout history that world order deteriorates without clear leadership and American leadership. Power vacuums tend to be filled by violent groups and repressive regimes, as we saw throughout the 20th century. And we are learning this lesson again, the hard way. American leadership has waned in the past 6 years, in my judgment, under a foreign policy approach that put the United States on the sidelines. Condoleezza Rice recently told me in a visit at Stanford, we can't expect every country to like us, but we can be either respected or feared. And today, we are neither. We've been appeasing rather than opposing our adversaries, including Russia, China, Syria, and especially Iran, the leading state sponsor of terror, which the president is allowing to remain on the threshold of nuclear weapons and on the march across the region. Our enemies are working aggressively to shape a world order that is founded on values contrary to our own. And nowhere is this more evident than with the rise of Islamist terror groups, which have spread like a wildfire on this president's watch because of two glaring failures on American leadership. The first failure was the president's decision to ignore reality and to downplay the threat. The White House spun a false narrative that the threat was receding. The president proclaimed that our fight was against core al-Qaeda and that the group was on its heels, on the path to defeat, and had been decimated. In the meantime, the president refused to characterize everything from the Fort Hood attack to the Boston Marathon bombing for what they were, acts of Islamist terrorism. The administration has been reluctant to recognize the threat because it defied the president's narrative, particularly his campaign narrative, and the legacy that he wanted. Ironically, just weeks after al-Baghdadi announced the formation of ISIS in 2013, the president announced that the global war on terrorism was effectively over. Anything I say here today, to me, that's one of the most impactful statements. The day Baghdadi announced the formation of ISIS, the very same day, our president announced that the global war on terrorism was effectively over. The second leadership failure was the president's decision to dismantle America's counterterrorism policies and return to a pre-9/11 law enforcement posture. The president stopped calling the conflict a war, despite the fact that our enemies were waging war against us. The president sought to close Guantanamo Bay and to release hardcore terrorists, despite the fact that the intelligence community warned 1/3 of them were rejoining the fight. Indeed, at least one of the Taliban 5 has already begun reviving terrorist ties. The president sought to give terrorists the same legal protections as U.S. citizens, despite the fact that they were unlawful enemy combatants. The president slashed military spending, despite the fact that his commanders warned him about America's inability to address looming threats. And the president opened up negotiations with terrorists and agreed to swap hostages, despite America's long-standing commitment against doing so. Perhaps worst of all, the president's inaction allowed terrorist safe havens to emerge or expand from the Middle East to West Africa, despite the 9/11 Commission's recommendations to use all elements of national power to root out terrorist sanctuaries. The conclusion is inescapable. Leading from behind has led us into danger. Sadly, the president, his recent national security strategy, doubles down on the same policies of retreat that got us into this mess and fails to identify the threat by name. In it, the president argues for strategic patience when what we really need is urgent action. He highlights his defense drawdown when we really need a defense plus up. And he continues to propose we treat terrorism as a police problem, a law enforcement problem, with one arm behind our back, instead of what it really is, and that is a war. The president's strategy also makes the stunning assertion that the risk of terrorist attacks against our homeland has diminished. I can tell you as chairman of Homeland Security that is simply not true. I stand before you as chairman of Homeland Security to tell you that the threat has not diminished. It has skyrocketed. 1 year after the president called ISIS the JV team of terrorism, the organization has inspired or directed more than 25 terrorist plots outside of Syria, and 15 of them have been successful. Yet in a recent interview, the president opined that terrorism is overhyped when compared to issues like climate change. His priorities are clear. For 6 years, the president has ignored the words of our enemies, forgetting an important lesson of history. For instance, we didn't take the words of Adolf Hitler seriously until the foot soldiers of the Third Reich marched across Europe. We didn't take the words of Vladimir Lenin seriously until communism spread across the globe. And unfortunately, the president didn't take the words of groups like ISIS seriously until they established a sweeping, self-proclaimed Islamic caliphate. It was no secret that extremists were seeking to get to this point. They've been dead set on creating a caliphate, a totalitarianism state ruled with the tenets of their hateful ideology. Ultimately, they hope to undermine the secular, democratic governments of the Western world. And for years, we have seen this goal spelled out in their propaganda and in their plans. And they're very open about what they're trying to do. And now they're closer to their goal with the formation of ISIS, tens of thousands of foreign fighters, and a spider web of terrorist franchises across the globe. I believe we are now entering the defining struggle of our generation and beyond. Violent Islamist extremists want nothing less than the destruction of our way of life. And now their ability to match words with deeds is growing at an astonishing rate. Studies have shown that between 2010 and 2013, the number of jihadist terror groups swelled 58%. And between 2012 and 2013, terrorism deaths spiked by 60%. I have no doubt the final numbers for last year were even worse. And in recent months, terrorists have struck multiple Western cities, including Paris, Sydney, Ottawa, and Brussels, and an Ohio-based ISIS sympathizer was arrested for planning to detonate pipe bombs here in Washington at the Capitol. In many ways, it is clear we are no longer talking about terrorist groups. We are now talking about terrorist armies. For instance, ISIS now controls a territory the size of Belgium, governs millions of people, draws on billions of dollars in revenue, and commands tens of thousands of foot soldiers. They have also attracted more than 20,000 foreign fighters from over 90 countries, exceeding the flow to Afghanistan in the 1980s. Make no mistake, in Syria and Iraq, we are witnessing the largest convergence of Islamist terrorists in world history. The momentum has compelled radical Islamists of all stripes to renew their calls to bring terror to the West. Last month, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula urged their followers to attack the United States and its allies. As a result, we face serious dual threats to the United States homeland: foreign fighters and homegrown terrorism. More than 150 Americans have tried or succeeded in joining extremists in Syria and Iraq, along with 3,000 to 5,000 other Westerners with visa-free access to the United States. Armed with military training, combat experience, and terrorist connections, these individuals are only a plane flight away and capable of plotting deadly attacks. I also have concerns that Islamist extremists may exploit a State Department plan to resettle thousands of Syrian refugees in the United States and use it to deploy operatives in our country. And at a hearing yesterday before my committee, the FBI very candidly expressed their concerns with the State Department's policy. And I asked point blank, will this bring greater risk to American lives? And stunningly, the FBI didn't follow the administration's script, but rather said yes. And so did the Department of Homeland Security. But radicalized individuals do not need to sneak into terrorist sanctuaries to become a danger to us. Overseas terrorist groups aren't yesterday's extremists, moving messages between couriers and caves, as we saw with Al-Qaeda and with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They are tailoring their hateful ideology toward Western audiences on social media, recruiting homegrown fanatics, and fueling a jihadi cool subculture. Already, their propaganda is leading to an uptick in homegrown terrorism. For example, there have been more than 90 homegrown terror plots or attacks in the United States since 9/11, and nearly 3/4 of them have taken place in the past 5 years. Many of the suspects were radicalized in part by online Islamist propaganda, including the Boston Marathon bombers. The rise of radicalism we are witnessing today is not a passing phenomenon. Instead, I believe we are merely at the beginning. Today's armies of Islamist terrorists will radicalize new generations, and the networks they form will have a ripple effect well into our future. The war against Islamist terror will be the great struggle of this country and this generation, and I believe we have a moral and strategic obligation to fight it. Through the course of history, there have been few forms of evil more sinister than that of violent Islamist extremism. We face an enemy whose ultimate goal is to conquer territory and impose its rule through mass fear, intimidation, rape, crucifixion, and murder. We have seen the images of child soldiers and brutal beheadings and beatings. And we have been stirred to action by the savagery against our own citizens as well. And while this enemy has no hope today of displacing Western governments, it has proven capable of doing so elsewhere. Their sanctuaries give them the freedom to solicit recruits and plot attacks designed to intimidate our people, damage our economy, and erode the fabric of our open society. The free world, when confronted with such a persistent threat to its basic values, cannot retreat from this. We must act. And for these reasons, we must urgently restore American leadership and devise a path and a strategy to victory in the war against Islamist terror. Defeating this spreading evil demands accepting the weighty responsibilities that belong to a great nation. Roosevelt and Churchill had the courage to confront fascism and defeat it. Similarly, Reagan and Thatcher and President Kennedy relegated communism to the ash heap of history. And like them, I believe we must rally the world to decisively eliminate the threat posed by Islamist terrorism. We can begin by coalescing around a grand strategy to wipe out these radicals and their twisted ideology. And our purpose should be clear. It must be the policy of the United States to roll back and defeat Islamist terror groups and prevent their reemergence in order to ensure the long-term security of the free world. And we should reserve the right to use every available means to do so. Right now, violent extremists appear to be winning. And whether or not their victories are real, we know that perceived success can breed real success. We need to make them appear to be losing to stop their momentum. I propose a 7-point plan of action to roll back and defeat Islamist terror groups. First, we must define the threat in order to defeat it. The president has been unwilling to call the threat what it is. We are at war with violent Islamist extremism. We are not at war with a single group, but with an evolving network of militants. Second, we must take the fight to the enemy. We cannot wait for Islamist terror to reach our shores before combating it, so we must go on the offensive. And our policy cannot be one of containment that the current administration is doing, but rather it must be total rollback. The president's current strategy against ISIS merely contains the problem. Indeed, airstrikes have not dislodged them from their territory, and they continue to draw thousands of new foot soldiers even since the airstrikes began. Now the administration is seeking an authorization for use of military force against ISIS, but the authorization takes options off the table and ties our hands, and specifically ties the hands of our generals. We need a ground force to eradicate this cancer, and we should mobilize coalition partners to assemble one. But a coalition cannot be a substitute for American leadership. And while we prefer not to deploy American ground troops into combat, we cannot rule out the possibility if we want to destroy ISIS. Taking options off the table telegraphs weakness to our enemies and emboldens them. Their territory fuels their narrative, and it must be recaptured. We didn't defeat communism until its biggest champion collapsed. In the same vein, you cannot have a strategy for defeating Islamist terror without visibly making its adherents lose. We must also counter all extremists across the spectrum, including the radical Iranian regime and its terror proxies. Third, we must target the enemy's tools, including targeting their financing and human capital flows. Islamist terror groups are pocketing everything from oil revenues to ransom payments. These financial arteries must be cut. Islamist terror groups also thrive on foreign fighters. We must work with our international partners to enhance their ability to detect, deter, and disrupt terrorist travel, and we must shut down the jihadi superhighway that has sprung up in Europe and all across Turkey. Yesterday, I announced that my committee is creating a task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel. This team will work to identify gaps in our defenses and recommend ways to shut down terrorist pathways. Fourth, we must deny terrorists safe havens overseas by confronting threats early. The president's dithering on Syria allowed ISIS and al-Qaeda to surge and made the threat more costly to eliminate. Now we are seeing ISIS spread into other failed or undergoverned states. In the future, we cannot afford to wait, and we cannot afford to play global whack-a-mole with terrorists. We must identify emerging extremist sanctuaries and implement strategies with our allies to keep them from becoming terrorist hotbeds. Fifth, we must defend the homeland against domestic radicalization. We are entering an era of do-it-yourself jihad, and terrorists are finding it easier to encourage individual attacks rather than sneak operatives into our country. But we are alarmingly unprepared to address the threats of homegrown terrorism. Our programs to combat it are only in their infancy, and the administration has failed to appoint a lead agency to address the problem. And it cannot even tell Congress how many people or how many dollars are devoted to it. In the latest DHS budget, the White House proposed spending more money on mitigating climate change than it did on countering violent extremism. I think that gives you a sense for the priorities. My committee has launched a full scope investigation into the administration's efforts in this space, and I hope we can quickly reconcile the deficiencies. Time is of the essence. 6, we must counter the insidious ideology at the core of Islamist terrorism. Defeating fanatics requires more than just bullets and bombs and drone strikes. It requires the force of our ideas. We must empower moderate Muslims in the Arab world to speak out forcefully against those hijacking their religion to instill terror. And we must expose the naked hypocrisy and brutal role of Islamist groups through effective counter-messaging campaigns. 7th and finally, we must promote liberty and human dignity as a great alternatives to repression and terror. Experience has taught us that repressive societies are the wellspring of fanaticism. And groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS were not born in Western capitals. They were given life in societies where individual liberty is suppressed and citizens have no voice in their own governments or their own future. We must work with our allies and partners over the long run to open up closed societies and to limit the conditions which allow extremism to flourish. Make no mistake, this is a long-term struggle, a struggle of ideology. But we can declare our plan of action as a first step. America must throw down the gauntlet on the doorsteps of the enemies of freedom, and put them on notice that their reign of terror will end. Radical Islamists may have fired the first shot in this struggle, but with the defense of our great nation and liberty as our guiding light, America will fire the last. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Fred.
That was a very serious and sobering presentation of the threat, and a detailed, even more detailed than usual, I think, presentation of an alternative strategy. There are a number of things that occurred to me as I listened to you speak. A lot of cognitive dissonance in the public debate. I think it's a little unusual to have so much disagreement between the White House and some people on the outside, prominent people, senior leaders like yourself, about basic facts, about fundamental issues. And I think the American people have a right to be a bit confused based on what's coming out of Washington. So I want to pick at a couple of those and ask you for your thoughts. First of all, you talked about the need to empower moderate Muslims. You also talked about the need to identify the problem as being Islamist extremism and about the president's refusal to identify it in that way. There are some who say that, in fact, the problem really is Islam and that it's naive to imagine that there are moderate Muslims, just as there are some who say that the issue has nothing at all to do with Islam, it's in fact about poverty and so forth. Where do you come down on that question?
Well, I think the horrific lighting on fire of the Jordanian pilot, and I said this on Face the Nation last Sunday, I hope is a wake-up call to the Arab nations and to the moderate Sunnis to take back not only their religion but their way of life. When I was over there last April in the Saudi and UAE, the Gulf states, there is a terror within those countries about ISIS. So I do think they need to step up to the plate to defend their own region. I think that has to be done under American leadership. But I think the ground forces, I mean, ideally you want that to come from the Arab nations. Turkey has a great military, so does Egypt. They've been reluctant so far to do anything. Jordan, off the record, told me 6 months ago they want to put troops in there, but for whatever reason have been held back. So I would say King Abdullah is a good example of Jordan as what a moderate Muslim is. Free Syrian Army no longer exists in Syria. But going back to ISIS and the narrative, I get these threat briefings similar to what the president gets, and sometimes when I see him speak, it's almost like either he's not attending the threat briefings or he is and he's being deceptive to the American people. I think it's important to be honest and tell the American people what the threat really is. And I think I've done that in the speech, but I think he has been wrestling internally, grappling with what his campaign narrative was. The campaign narrative, remember, was to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and shut down Guantanamo. And he's very frustrated that he can't achieve that now. The immediate pullout from Iraq and the failure to negotiate a status of forces agreement and the complete political malfeasance on the part of Maliki created ISIS. Hillary Clinton went to Baghdad only one time as Secretary of State. They didn't care about Iraq, and now it has created ISIS. And I think the president's had a hard time getting his head wrapped around ISIS and the fact that we have to confront ISIS. And it wasn't until the American journalist was executed that the American people woke up to my God, this is an evil threat to the United States. So I think he's been wrestling with this. And then the AUMF that recently came out, and I want you to ask more questions, but just demonstrates once again this failure to lead, failure to do the right thing to define the enemy and destroy the enemy.
Do you think that we need a new AUMF?
You know, I think he could operate under the 2001, and the White House is very candid about that. I do think the threat has evolved. I think it's important that Congress assert itself, but I would rather have no AUMF than the one he's proposed. I think you'll see us have hearings in the Congress, and I do think it's imperative that we assert our own AUMF. What would I support? I would support an AUMF that would authorize the defeat and destruction of ISIS and its associates wherever they exist. I don't think the president's going to agree to that. But I'm not going to support an AUMF that ties the hands of our generals once again, that micromanages this conflict, and weakens our ability to defeat ISIS, which is precisely what this AUMF does. And in our conversations with the White House, they almost agreed to that point. I can't support that, and it makes you wonder about their grand strategy of dealing with ISIS.
So are we going to be in a really sort of weird position where the president sends a restrictive AUMF to Congress, Congress passes an AUMF giving him more authority, and he vetoes the AUMF giving him more authority?
That's a fight I'd like to have. Because I think it would demonstrate the differences of opinion.
Yeah, I guess we could define that as cognitive dissonance. That would really be fascinating. So I think another issue that you brought out very strongly is the need to take the fight to the enemy and the risks that are posed to the United States by the safe havens that extreme violent Islamist extremists have. But there's, as you know, a lively debate about that. And you also talked about self-radicalization and radicalization over the internet and so forth. And I think it's a legitimate question for people to ask, you know, are we not excessively focused on the safe havens abroad? And since we're not going to be able to shut down every website and we're not going to be able to stop these guys from using social media, and we do have this phenomenon of self-radicalization or that internet radicalization going on, is it a good idea for us actually to be engaging in wars all over the place to go after safe havens in that circumstance?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask the question, if you knew about 9/11 before it happened, what would you do to bin Laden hiding under the cover of the Taliban in Afghanistan? Would you allow that safe haven to continue, or would you stop it? And I would argue that's true all throughout Northern Africa and the Middle East right now. We're seeing this, these al-Qaeda affiliates. To me, it's all the same. It's the ideology. ISIS has more brutal tactics, which is why core al-Qaeda has denounced them. But the ideology is the same. And it's spreading like a wildfire all throughout Northern Africa and the Middle East. And through this internet, very sophisticated internet campaign, it's a global phenomenon now. Which you talk about the radicalization over the internet. It's going to be very hard to stop that from happening. It's also going to be very hard to stop a small-scale Paris-style attack from happening in the United States. I'm very, very worried about that over the next year. And so I do think we have an obligation to lead. Some would say we should retreat from the world and be isolationists. I think we've seen throughout history that led us, that didn't stop World War I, World War II, and then we had to lead. And I would prefer to lead now, and I think we have an obligation to ensure that these power vacuums are not created, that these sanctuaries do not become sanctuaries for jihadists, for Islamist extremism, and we can defeat this ideology not just through the military, but through a political, diplomatic, but our own social media campaign. Because our ideas, our Western ideas, are better, and we prevail. It's just getting the message out there. Some would argue dropping a bunch of iPhones into Iran for the younger generation. They're cut off from the West. They don't know about our ideas other than what they're taught, and that is that the West is evil, it's Satan, and it needs to be destroyed. But through the power of ideas, we can defeat them.
Yeah, I think the problem with dropping iPhones into Iran is the internet censorship in Iran, which I know,
That's right.
with your concern about cybersecurity, would make that just another vector for the regime.
We can talk about cyber for a while if you'd like to.
Oh, yeah. But there's another sort of cognitive dissonance that I want to explore a little bit, because the president has been pretty clear in characterizing the alternatives to his approach. And pretty much every time he talks about the alternative, he talks about, so you just want to send massive numbers of U.S. troops into every country in the world where there are extremists and keep them there forever. Is that what you want to do?
No, look, I think occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan is probably a thing of the past. But we, obviously, in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, need special operations to guide the airstrikes. We need them to embed with the Peshmerga, embed with the Iraqi forces. There is no Free Syrian Army anymore, but to embed and lead, because I don't think they're capable of doing it on their own. We don't want the great Satan's presence so dominating there, because sometimes that fuels and inflames. But I don't think, again, we take that option off the table. What if a year from now, the Joint Chiefs go to the president and say, you know what, the Arab nations are not stepping up to the plate. ISIS is growing. It's a real threat to the homeland, and this is the only way we know how to destroy it. Why would we take that option off the table through an AUMF? Congress restricting the power of the president and our military to defeat and destroy ISIS? I don't think you're going to see many on our side supporting that.
So another argument that the administration and its and allies and other people who are not tied to the administration have been making, especially in Syria, is that by going after, if we were to go after the Assad regime, if we were really to go after the Shia elements on the ground that are fighting ISIS, all we would really be doing would be empowering ISIS. And so we really have to pursue a de facto alliance with Iran and its proxies, because they are the only forces in the region that are actively taking it to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, some would say. What's your reaction to that?
That's a bit of a dangerous alliance. I get the idea the Shia militants don't like ISIS. They fight them because they're Sunni. The Russians don't like ISIS because they have their Chechen rebels in their backyard. They don't like Islamist terror. We have that in common with them. But these Arab nations, in my judgment, are not going to be willing to put a full ground force in play unless they see we're committed to taking out Assad as well. Why is that problematic? Because right now this administration is conducting what I think is a very naive negotiation exercise with the Ayatollah to dismantle his nuclear weapons program. And we know from intelligence that they're playing us, and it's a game of manipulation. So they're really putting their negotiations with Iran over this defeating ISIS strategy to some extent. I know General Keane agrees with that concept. I think they need assurances that we're all in to win this. We can't carry the water. They do expect us to carry the water, and in the past they do. And I don't think that should be a strong signal as well. Don't expect us to carry all the water this time. You need to step up to the plate as well. We will help lead this effort, and we should. But I think they also need reassurances what our goal is. And right now, there's so much uncertainty in foreign policy that I believe it's making this world a far more dangerous place, because our allies don't know what our foreign policy is, and it changes. It's not consistent. and they don't know if we're a true ally or not.
You also mentioned, coming back to the homeland threat, you mentioned the problems that you see in just trying to defend ourselves against this sort of threat. And I wonder how you see the reforms and the changes that have been made to the way the intelligence community operates in the wake of the Snowden releases and so forth. How are they affecting, or might they affect, our ability to detect plots and take action?
Well, yeah, Snowden has greatly damaged our intelligence capability. I can't go into the DIA assessment, but suffice to say, it's to me what he targeted looked beyond that of a systems administrator. It looked like there was some other force directing him to where to go to steal this information that deals with a lot of it's China, Russia directed, I think, even things into things like submarine warfare. And so I think he's done tremendous damage. But I will say, since 9/11, that our capabilities are far greater. It'd be very difficult to pull off a 9/11 style attack. I think a cell that large would be intercepted and disrupted, which is why they're evolving now to smaller scale attacks, which is more difficult to stop. And I think that's what you're more likely to see happen, would be a smaller scale attack in the United States. And that's what we're concerned about, because it is so hard to disrupt. And at the same time, you have AQAP and the Khorasan group in Syria who've constantly been plotting the bombing of airplanes, the aviation sector. They're still very intent on external operations against the United States and the West through airplanes. And we're trying to stay one step ahead. But Inspire magazine, of all things, step by step, shows you how to make a non-metallic IED, which is what we're most concerned about getting onto an airplane. Imagine that scenario of it coming from Europe, flying into JFK, and blowing up an airplane over New York. That's a great threat that we see that we're trying to stop. We have heightened our security at the 25 airports overseas, and I think our counterterrorism capabilities are far greater than Europe. I think Europe, you saw Paris, Brussels, London, Berlin, they're still in a sort of pre-9/11 state, and we need to bring them up, their curve up, and we need to also exchange information on no-fly lists, watch lists. These two brothers in Paris traveled to Yemen and back, and they were on a no-fly list. It's hard to imagine how that could happen, but that greater information sharing needs to happen with Europe. That's a gateway to the United States.
So you mentioned Inspire, which is the magazine put out by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was brought to its a high level by Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed in a drone strike, which epitomized, in a certain sense, what the Obama administration's approach has been, which is drone strikes and other things to kill individual leaders, and yet Inspire is back and better than ever, and high quality, evil magazine putting this sort of stuff out. So is that can we draw conclusions from that example about the effectiveness of this targeted strike approach?
Yeah, look, I'm all for that's not the panacea. I'm all for targeted drone strikes against Al-Qaeda leadership, and that was a very successful strike against Awlaki, who was a real threat, particularly to the United States. He was associated with the hijackers. He was here in Virginia. But it's not the end all. And I've always said drone strikes alone can't kill an ideology. So we need to be dealing with this from a State Department standpoint as well, as how do you defeat an ideology? We can have a military plan to kill ISIS, but as long as the ideology is still bringing in recruitments, you have to deal with that long-term struggle of ideology, and how do you best defeat that? Speaking of Awlaki in Yemen, as you know, the Houthi Shia militants now have caused great chaos in Yemen. We've evacuated our embassy. They've taken some of our vehicles. So the sanctuary, safe haven that AQAP has enjoyed for so long, I would argue is becoming safer, because we literally had to pull out our presence out of Yemen and also our intelligence services out of Yemen. So now they can run around with impunity in Yemen. That's going to heighten the threat again to the aviation sector.
So in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So raise your hand, I'll call on you. Wait for the microphone. We'll start over here. Please identify yourself. Can't get there? Okay, we'll start over here. Please identify yourself and make a brief question, not a statement.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that. Brenton Adams. I'm part of the DoD and also a grad student at American University. My question kind of goes into kind of like the defense politics portion of this. With the watered down AUMF and kind of the QDR and national security strategy completely, downsizing our forces, what do you think your colleagues, like in the Appropriations Committee, Armed Service Committee, what would you tell them needs to happen?
Well, first let me just say, when we met with the White House, we asked, did you confer with the generals on this? It was very unclear. I would argue this is a political document. It's not a serious policy exercise on an AUMF and a political compromise with the Democrats. I favor increased spending over sequestration limits. There is no greater priority under the Constitution than providing for a common defense. I believe that has been weakened greatly under this administration. I'm kind of a Churchill kind of guy. I think Churchill's philosophy, I think President Kennedy talked about a strong defense, President Reagan. And they were right. And every time we slip into a weaker military, like under the Carter administration, we find ourselves in a more dangerous world, and we find more threats to the United States. And I think that's where we are right now. And I think it is time. And what's happening now will have, as you know, consequences for decades if we don't stop the course. There are some, even in my party, though, who disagree that we should, the Budget Control Act, we shouldn't break that ceiling with respect to defense. But I think we have a far weaker military today and Department of Defense, and we need to strengthen it, even if it means raising the caps from sequestration.
Thank you.
Over here.
Sylwia Szawowska from the Polish Embassy. I would like to ask you two questions. First, as for the fight against ISIS in Syria, we all know what a very difficult situation is there. What's your assessment on how U.S. should support Free Syrian Army or whoever moderate Syrian opposition in terms of also a lack of decision on how to proceed with Bashar al-Assad regime, because that seems to be quite crucial there. And the second one, how do you see the Russian policy or Russian aggressive politics in Ukraine as a threat to U.S. interest and perhaps Homeland Security?
Right. I think the only thing we have in common with Russia right now is our disdain for the Islamist terrorists. It is complicated. You mentioned Iran, and so that plays in with Assad. Iran, it could be a partner against ISIS. I prefer to see more of these Sunni Arab nations step up to the plate. I know Jordan's been wanting to do this for quite some time. I think Turkey, as Secretary Baker talked about 2 Sundays ago, they have a great fighting military. But Erdogan is very uncomfortable. He's sitting on the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, and he plays both sides, and he's not willing to commit to this fight. Egypt has a great military, but they have been unwilling to demonstrate going after these forces. I think it needs American leadership, and we have the best in terms of special operations and airstrikes to help with that. But we have had a policy of containment thus far with limited success in airstrikes, not a policy to defeat and destroy ISIS. And that should be the spelled out goal, is the destruction of ISIS. This AUMF is yet another, I think, demonstration of how this administration is not serious about that goal. Even though they may say that, the deeds don't add up to what the actions don't add up to what the words are. And so I think the policy of defeat and destruction, and it can only be achieved not just through airstrikes, but by a ground force. My dad was a bombardier in a B-17 in World War II, and he and many others led the air campaign in advance of D-Day and Battle of the Bulge. And while that caused great damage on the ground, you couldn't win that until we had our ground forces invade at Normandy. And that's a good illustration of how you can strike, but you can't actually defeat them because they are embedded with civilians too. And with strikes, you're going to take out innocent civilians too. You have to have that ground force. I'd rather see the Sunni moderate attacking the Sunni extremists to take back their own region and their own religion at the end of the day. But it's going to require, again, American leadership. With respect to Russia and Mr. Putin, and I was over there during the Sochi Olympics when the suicide bombers were going off. I've never experienced greater surveillance on myself. It is a police state, and with monitors in my hotel room, and you could see the FSB, following us around. And it's a little spooky. And I think Mr. Putin, being a KGB once and always, has this mentality. I think his strategy is to regain the glory of the old Soviet empire, which is in his polling, even though economically Russia's not doing as well. But that is what the Russian people want to hear. Through annexing Russian-speaking peoples in the Baltic states. What we saw in Crimea is a good illustration, example of what his long-term foreign policy really is. And the fact is, he can get away with it. Weakness invites aggression. We've seen that throughout history. And so because of the weakness of this administration, similar to what the Carter administration did, we're seeing a revived Russia going back to like the old Soviet, where Putin knows he can attack Ukraine and no one's going to respond. Now, I sent a letter along with Steny Hoyer and Adam Schiff calling for lethal weapons to go to Ukraine. I also think we had to lift the ban on crude exports, which the EU has asked for. It would help them get off their dependence on Russian oil, and it would help our economy. It's a great foreign policy at the same time. And so I think Russia is becoming more and more of a threat, not like the radical Islamists. Their tactics are very different. But I'll give you one illustration that got the hair on my neck a little bit. My wife was a naval intelligence officer and tracked Russian subs, Soviet subs. And after the Cold War, they retreated into the bastions. Well, they're back. And this shows you Putin is beating his breast. He's a very macho guy. And he's this bravado of his military, the audacity to start sending Russian subs off the coast of the United States. A lot of people don't know about that, but it's a very powerful illustration of the threat that they are now posing to us as well, because all across the globe, they view us as a weaker United States, not a strong United States that can lead the world. And they want us to lead in many of these countries I've been to. I went to Saudi and they said, why are you negotiating with Iran? That is so naive. And I have to tell them that I don't agree with that policy. Or why do you support the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? Because we supported Morsi at the time. Those are failed foreign policy exercises that creates a lot of uncertainty in that part of the world.
So I just want to finish on Russia, actually, since among other things we had big news last night. We have a peace deal, apparently. And there's a sour joke that you can tell about Russia. That, what do you call it when organized military forces equipped with tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, attack helicopters, rockets, and combat aviation fight one another? Well, in Ukraine, we call it a ceasefire. So do you think that this peace deal that was reached last night will be more effective than previous peace deals?
I mean, I'm always hopeful that we can negotiate, but I have a healthy amount of skepticism. Trust but verify, as Reagan said, and I'm hopeful that could, but I just know what his overarching foreign policy goal is to take back the former Soviet Union. I don't think that peace deal is consistent with his policy, and so therefore I remain a bit skeptical of that. He needs to know that he's going to be met with force, that he can't be aggressive with impunity and not be stopped, because if that signal is given to him, which it has been, he's going to continue this aggressive posture.
And you think the sanctions that have been imposed on him are not enough of a counterforce?
I mean, it's had impact, but not enough to change his foreign policy, no.
Do you see him threatening NATO? I mean, do you see him going
Well,
after
his
NATO
great
countries?
fear, and he's a very paranoid individual, is that his fear is that Ukraine will be part of NATO, and he sees NATO encroaching on his doorstep. So to try to get into the mindset of Mr. Putin, I think that's how he sees NATO expansion as the biggest threat to Russia, and therefore he's fighting that. I tend to agree that, you know, if we annex or make NATO or Ukraine part of NATO, that's a dangerous, while it's a noble aspiration, I think it would be a bit dangerous because it almost automatically puts us at war with Russia.
Chairman McCaul, you've articulated, I think, a very sophisticated view of the threat, a very grave view of the threat, and a very damning indictment of current policy, and offered some policy alternatives. And we're very grateful to have had the opportunity to listen to you here. So thank you so much for what you're doing, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.